Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming, and it is always both an honor and a pleasure to be at Sisterhood Bookstore, one of the great bookstores in this country. I'm going to read to you from Life and Death, which is a collection of essays and speeches, some of which have been published, some of which have not been published before this. But the ones that have been published in ways in which the readers are very circumscribed, so that many people will be finding these essays available for the very first time, even though some of them have been published before. Of necessity, I have to try to find a way to communicate what this book is like to you by reading only small parts of it. To me, this is a complex and interesting set of political confrontations and concerns, and it also brings into play my concern about the quality of writing, which I think is in part a political concern. I believe in writing. I believe in it as a art form. I believe in it as a democratic means of communication. And so Life and Death is really also about that. The first piece I would like to read an excerpt from is about Nicole Brown Simpson. I wrote 3 pieces for the Los Angeles Times about the battery of Nicole Brown Simpson. The first one was published right after she had been murdered. The second one was published during the criminal trial, and the third one was written and published directly after the criminal acquittal. And that is the section I would like to read to you. It was published on October 8th, 1995. I think what I want the water closer to me, so I'm just going to move this. Excuse me. I'm going to do this. Put this here, like that. And I'm going to put this here. No, I think that's fine. Everybody can see.
Right where you are?
Everything is fine.
Oh, okay,
Good. This is called After the Acquittal, Domestic Violence Trying to Flee. 5 days before Nicole Brown Simpson was murdered on June 12, 1994, she called a battered women's shelter in terror that her ex-husband was going to kill her. The jury was not told this because she couldn't be cross-examined. Guess not. Most of the rest of the evidence of beating and stalking from 1977 to May 1994 was also excluded. O.J. Simpson had stalked her not once, as represented to the jury, but over at least a 2-year period. Prosecutors have been permitted to introduce 7 incidents of stalking, but they chose to admit only 1 into evidence. The jury, predominantly women, was not responding to the wife abuse evidence, said observers. In fact, during an interview late last week, one woman juror called the domestic abuse issue, quote, a waste of time, end quote. Polls during the trial confirmed women were indifferent to the beatings Nicole Simpson endured. As a woman who escaped an assassin husband and is still haunted by fear and flashbacks, I agreed with Deputy District Attorney Christopher A. Darden that in 1989, Nicole Simpson knew someday her husband would kill her. She told many people, including her sister Denise, that he'd kill her and get away with it. In fact, you can take a battered woman's knowledge of her abuser's capacity to inflict harm and evade consequences to the bank. But 5 days before Nicole Simpson was murdered, she knew for sure she would die. How? Why? Something had happened. A confrontation, a threatening phone call, an unwanted visit, an aggressive act from Simpson directed at her. She told no one because after 17 years of torment, She knew there was no one to tell. The police virtually everywhere ignore assault against women by their male intimates so that any husband can be a brutal cop with tacit state protection. In Los Angeles, the police visited Nicole Simpson's abuser at home as fans. Remember the video showing Simpson after the ballet recital with the Brown family, introduced by the defense to show Simpson's pleasant demeanor. Hours later, Nicole Simpson was dead. In the video, she is as far from Simpson physically as she can manage. He does not nod or gesture to her. He kisses her mother, embraces and kisses her sister, and bear hugs her father. They all reciprocate. She must have been the loneliest woman in the world. What would Nicole Simpson have had to do to be safe? Go underground, change her appearance and identity, get cash without leaving a trail, take her children and run, all within days of her call to the shelter. She would have had to end all communication with family and friends without explanation for years, as well as leave her home and everything familiar. With this abuser's wealth and power, he would have had her hunted down. A dream team of lawyers would have taken her children from her. She would have been the villain, reckless, a slut, reviled for stealing the children of a hero. If his abuse of her is of no consequence now that she's been murdered, how irrelevant would it have been as she, resourceless, tried to make a court and the public understand that she needed to run for her life? Nicole Simpson knew she couldn't prevail, and she didn't try. Instead of running, she did what the therapist said: be firm, draw a line. So she drew the sort of line they meant. He could come to the recital but not sit with her or go to dinner with the family. A line that was no defense against death. Believing he would kill her, she did what most battered women do: kept up the appearance of normality. There was no equal justice for her, no self-defense she felt entitled to. Society had already left her to die. On the same day, the police who beat Rodney G. King were acquitted in Simi Valley. A white husband who had raped, beaten, and tortured his wife, also white, was acquitted of marital rape in South Carolina. He had kept her tied to a bed for hours, her mouth gagged with adhesive tape. He videotaped a half hour of her ordeal, during which he cut her breasts with a knife. The jury, which saw the videotape, had 8 women on it. Asked why they acquitted, they said he needed help. They looked right through the victim, afraid to recognize any part of themselves shamed by her violation. There were no riots afterwards. The governing reality for women of all races is that there is no escape from male violence, because it is inside and outside, intimate and predatory. While race hate has been expressed through forced segregation, woman hate is expressed through forced closeness, which makes punishment swift, easy, and sure. In private, women often empathize with one another across race and class because their experiences with men are so much the same. But in public, including on juries, women rarely dare. For this reason, no matter how many women are battered, no matter how many football stadiums battered women could fill on any given day, each one is alone. Surrounded by family, friends, and a community of affluent acquaintances, Nicole Simpson was alone. Having turned to police, prosecutors, victims' aid, therapists, and a women's shelter, she was still alone. Ronald L. Goldman may have been the only person in 17 years with the courage to try to intervene physically in an attack on her. And he's dead, killed by the same hand that killed her, an expensively gloved, extra-large hand. Though the legal system has mostly consoled and protected batterers, when a woman is being beaten, it's the batterer who has to be stopped. As Malcolm X used to say, by any means necessary. A principle all women, had better learn. A woman has a right to her own bed, a home she can't be thrown out of, and for her body not to be ransacked and broken into. She has a right to safe refuge, to expect her family and friends to stop the batterer by law or force before she's dead. She has a constitutional right to a gun and a legal right to kill if she believes she's going to be killed. And a batterer's repeated assault should lawfully be taken as intent to kill. Everybody's against wife abuse, but who's prepared to stop it? Thank you. Thank you. That was published in the Los Angeles Times, and several pieces in this book, In Life and Death, have been published in the Los Angeles Times, which is the only newspaper in the country that solicits material from me. I would like to read you a portion of, I'm sorry, oh, my eyes are getting so bad, of something that was published in the New York Times Book Review. The only thing, actually, of mine that they've ever published, except for a short letter. And this I submitted as an article. It was an answer to an article John Irving had published about censorship and pornography, basically saying that all of us, especially feminists who oppose pornography, were censors and prudes and Puritans. And he said it over and over and over and over again, and there was plenty of space for him. When I submitted this article, I was told it had to be cut down into letter form. And what happened is that all of the ideas were taken out of it, and the narrative that had to do with my history of sexual abuse was left in. Right? That was what they would publish, and I had to make a decision about what's more important here. And I decided, much against my own temperament, that to publish the abridged version was better than not to publish anything. So in Life and Death, there is the full article. And I'd just like to read you a small part of it. And I was in there for 4 days because of a Vietnam demonstration. I was sexually assaulted in the Women's House of Detention by 2 doctors. And I was mute when I came out. I was unable to speak. This was in 1965, long before the women's movement was there. So I will read you these few paragraphs. I had always wanted to be a writer in the Ulysses Lawrence Miller mode, but I learned without knowing it the first rule of speech for a woman, who is, after all, not quite a human being when a man is forcibly sticking something up her. Keep your mouth shut. Don't write it down. Don't sign it. Don't say it, even if you can. And at first, I couldn't. I came out of the Women's House of Detention mute. Speech depends on believing you can make yourself understood, that a community of people will recognize the experience in the words you use, and they will care. You also have to be able to understand what happened to you enough to convey it to other people. I lost speech. I was hurt past what I had words for. I lived out on the streets for several days, not having a bed of my own, still bleeding, and finally spoke because Grace Paley, the writer, used kindness to make me tell her what had happened to me. She convinced me that she would both understand and care. Then I spoke a lot. A grand jury investigated, columnists indicted the prison, but no one ever mentioned sexual assault. The grand jury concluded that the prison was just fine. I left the country to be a writer, my human dream. Now, to make this short, if not sweet, a year later I came back having learned that the kindness of strangers is most meaningful when you get it in cash up front. I spent a lot of years out on the street, living hand to mouth, these New York streets and other hard cities. I can hide my prostituting because I went to college, and no one ever looks for a woman's real life anyway. I thought I was a real tough ass, and I was. Tough callous, tough numb, tough desperate, tough scared, tough hungry, tough beaten by men often, tough done it every which way, including up. All of my colleagues who fight against pornography with me know that I prostituted. I know about the lives of women in pornography because I lived pornography. So have many feminists who fight pornography. Freedom looks very different when you are the one it is being done on. It's his, not yours. Speech is different too. Those sexy expletives are the hate words he uses on you while he is using you. And your speech is an inchoate protest never voiced. In my work, fiction and nonfiction, I've tried to voice the protest against a power that is dead weight on you. Fist and penis organized to keep you quiet. I would do virtually anything to get women out of prostitution and pornography, which is technologized prostitution. With pornography, a woman can still be sold after the beatings. The rapes, the pain, the humiliation have killed her. I write for her, in behalf of her, to try to intervene before she dies. I know her. I have come close to being her. I read a lot of books. None of them ever told me the truth about what happens to women until feminists started writing and publishing in this wave over these last 22 years. Over and over, male writers call prostituted women speech. Their speech, their right. Without this exploitation published for profit, the male writer feels censored. The woman lynched naked on a tree or restrained with ropes and a ball gag in her mouth has what? Freedom of what? I lost my ability to speak, became mute a second time in my life. I've written about being a battered wife. I was beaten and tortured over a period of a few years. Amnesty International never showed up. Toward the end, when I would either die or escape, I lost all speech. Words were useless to the likes of me. I had run away and asked for help and had been sent back many times. My words didn't seem to mean anything, or it was okay to torture me. Taken once by my husband to a doctor when hurt, I risked asking for help. He said he could write me a prescription for Valium or have me committed. The neighbors heard the screaming, but no one did anything. So what good are words? I have always been good with them, but never good enough to be believed or helped. No, there were no shelters then, but I am talking about speech. It isn't easy for me. I come from under him, tortured and tormented. What he does to me takes away everything. He is the owner of everything. He hurts all the words out of me, and no one will listen anyway. I come to speech from under the brutalities of thousands of men. For me, the violence of marriage was worse than the violence of prostitution. But this is no paradigm for choice. Men act out pornography. They have acted it out on me. Women's lives become pornography. Mine did. And so for 20 years now, I have been looking for the words to say what I know. Thank you. Thank you. This is my view, what I just read you, about how we need to approach freedom of speech. These are the issues, the underlying issues of freedom of speech that no one wants to talk about. These are the issues that have to do what happens if you're silenced before you can even start speaking. All right, so I say that when we talk about censorship and freedom of speech, we're not discussing the real stuff. And the real stuff is what happens in people's lives that keeps them from being able to speak. I would like to read you a short piece from an essay called Israel, Whose Country Is It Anyway? It was published in Ms. Magazine. And this is just sort of an abridged part of this article. What's important about it is that in every country one has to look under the surface and try to understand what is really happening to women in that country. You have to see it to believe it, and even seeing it might not help. I've been sent it over the years by feminists in Israel. I had seen it. I didn't really believe it. Unlike in the United States, pornography is not an industry. You find it in mainstream magazines and advertising. It is mostly about the Holocaust. In it, Jewish women are sexualized as Holocaust victims for Jewish men to masturbate over. Well, would you believe it, even if you saw it? Israeli women call it Holocaust pornography. The themes are fire, gas, trains, emaciation, and death. In the fashion layout, 3 women in swimsuits are posed as if they are looking at and moving away from 2 men on motorcycles. The motorcycles, black metal, are menacingly in the foreground, moving toward the women. The women, fragile and defenseless in their near nudity, are in the background. Then the women, now dressed in scanty underwear, are shown running from the men, with emphasis on thighs, breasts thrust out, hips highlighted. Their faces look frightened and frenzied. The men are physically grabbing them. Then the women, now in new bathing suits, are sprawled on the ground, apparently dead, with parts of their bodies severed from them and scattered around as trains bear down on them. Even as you see a severed arm, a severed leg, the trains coming toward them, the women are posed to accentuate the hips and place of entry into the vaginal area. Or a man is pouring gasoline into a woman's face. Or she's posed next to a light fixture that looks like a shower head. Or 2 women, ribs showing, in scanty underwear, are posed in front of a stone wall, prison-like, with a fire extinguisher on one side of them and a blazing open oven on the other. Their body postures replicate the body postures of naked concentration camp inmates in documentary photographs. Of course, there is also sadism without ethnicity, outside the trauma of history. You think Jewish men can't be regular, good old boys? The cover of the magazine shows a naked woman spread out, legs open, with visual emphasis on her big breasts. Nails are driven through her breasts. Huge pliers are attached to one nipple. She is surrounded by hammers, pliers, saws. She has what passes for an orgasmic expression on her face. The woman is real. The tools are drawn. The caption reads, "Sex in the Workshop." The same magazine published all the visual violence described above. Monoton is a left liberal slick monthly for the intelligentsia and upper class. It has high production and aesthetic values. Israel's most distinguished writers and intellectuals publish in it. Or in a magazine for women that is not unlike Ladies' Home Journal, there is a photograph of a woman tied to a chair with heavy rope. Her shirt is torn off her shoulders and upper chest, but her arms are tied up against her so that only the fleshy part of the upper breast is exposed. She is wearing pants. They are wet. A man fully dressed standing next to her is throwing beer in her face. In the United States, such photographs of women are found in bondage magazines. For purists, there is an Israeli pornography magazine. The issue I saw had a front page headline that read, "Orgy at Yad Vashem." Yad Vashem is the memorial in Jerusalem to the victims of the Holocaust. Under the headline, there was a photograph of a man sexually entangled with several women. What does this mean? Other than that if you are a Jewish woman, you don't run to Israel, you run from it. I went to the Institute for the Study of Media and Family on Herzliya Street in Haifa, an organization built to fight violence against women. Working with the Rape Crisis Center and desperately fundraising to stay alive, the Institute analyzes the content of media violence against women. It exposes and fights the legitimacy pornography gets by being incorporated into the mainstream. There is outrage on the part of women at the Holocaust pornography, a deep, ongoing shock, but little understanding for me too. Having seen it here, having tried to absorb it, then seeing stacks of it at the Institute, I felt numb and upset. Here I had slides. In Israel, I saw the whole magazines, the context in which the photographs were published. These really were mainstream venues for violent pornography, with a preponderance of Holocaust pornography. That made it worse, more real, more incomprehensible. A week later, I spoke in Tel Aviv about pornography to an audience that was primarily feminist. One feminist suggested I had a double standard. Didn't all men do this, not just Israeli men? I said, no, in the United States, Jewish men are not the consumers of Holocaust pornography. Black men aren't the consumers of plantation pornography. But now I'm not sure. Do I know that, or have I just assumed it? Why do Israeli men like this? Why do they do it? They are the ones who do it. Women aren't even tokens in the upper echelons of media, advertising, or publishing, nor are fugitive Nazis with new identities. I think feminists in Israel must make this why an essential question. Either the answer will tell us something new about the sexuality of men everywhere, or it will tell us something special about the sexuality of men who go from victim to victimizer. How has the Holocaust been sexualized for Israeli men? And what does this have to do with sexualized violence against women in Israel? What does it have to do with this great dynamic pushing of women lower and lower? Are Jewish women going to be destroyed again by Nazis, this time with Israeli men as their surrogates? Is the sexuality of Israeli men shaped by the Holocaust? Does it make them come? I don't know if Israeli men are different from other men by virtue of using the Holocaust against Jewish women for sexual excitement. I do know that the use of Holocaust sex is unbearably traumatic for Jewish women. Its place in the Israeli mainstream itself, a form of sadism. I also know that as long as the Holocaust pornography exists, Only male Jews are different from those pitiful creatures on the trains in the camps. Jewish women are the same. How then does Israel save us?